Paul Newman named the darkest personalities of Hollywood's golden age. Paul Newman sat across from a journalist and said something so quiet, so calm, and so devastating that the room went completely still. He said the most dangerous people in Hollywood were never the villains on screen. They were the beloved ones, the ones with the Oscars, the ones on the magazine covers, the ones America trusted completely. And then he started naming them. What came out of his mouth over the course of several interviews, private conversations, and public panels was a list that Hollywood desperately tried to keep quiet. Because these were not small names. These were legends, icons, people whose faces are still on posters, whose movies still air on television, whose names still make audiences smile. But Newman had been inside that world long enough to know what was hiding behind the smiles. He had watched it happen. He had heard the stories from people too scared to speak up. And at a certain point, he stopped playing the game of silence. This video is about what he saw, what he knew, and why the truth he tried to tell was one of the most uncomfortable things Hollywood has ever had to face. Stay with us, because some of the names on this list are going to hit you like a truck. Section 1. The system that built the legends and buried the secrets. Before we get to the names, you have to understand the world Paul Newman was living inside. Because without that context, none of this makes complete sense. Hollywood in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s was not just an entertainment industry. It was a machine. A carefully controlled, enormously powerful machine that manufactured dreams for a living. And the fuel that kept that machine running was not film, it was image. Studios owned everything. They owned the actors' contracts. They owned the stories that went to the press. They owned the relationships actors were seen having in public. If a star was photographed in the wrong place with the wrong person, the studio's people were already on the phone before the picture was even developed. Editors were warned, journalists were paid. Stories vanished before they ever made it to print. This was called the studio system, and for decades it worked perfectly. The public saw exactly what the studios wanted them to see. A world of glamour, warmth, talent, and heroism. A world where the biggest stars were better than ordinary people. More exciting, more beautiful, more good. Paul Newman entered Hollywood in the mid-1950s, right as this system was starting to crack. He was young, brilliant, and sharp enough to understand what was really going on around him. He watched colleagues get their careers destroyed for speaking out of turn. He watched studios protect powerful men who had done terrible things. He watched women get pushed aside, silenced, or simply erased from the story. Newman played the game just enough to survive, but he never forgot what he saw, and unlike many of his peers, he eventually chose to talk. What made Newman especially credible was that he was not an outsider pointing fingers. He was a genuine Hollywood legend himself. Blue eyes, natural talent, decades of respected work. He had no reason to lie, no grudge to settle, and no career left to protect by the time he started speaking most freely. He talked because he believed the truth deserved air. The people he named were not random. They were specific, concrete, and the patterns he described were not coincidences. They were the result of a system that told powerful people they could do anything they wanted, and that fame would always protect them. So let's start at the beginning, with the name that, in many ways, shocked the world hardest. Not because of what was hidden, but because of how completely the truth was buried under an image of perfection. Section 2. The mothers, the monsters, and the masks they wore. Joan Crawford was the kind of star who made you believe in magic. When she walked into a room, heads turned. When she appeared on screen, the camera seemed almost afraid to look away. In 1946, she accepted the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Mildred Pierce. She received it in bed because she claimed to be too ill to attend the ceremony. The move only made her more dramatic and beloved. Hollywood ate it up. Paul Newman later reflected on Crawford in a late 1970s interview. He said, slowly and without drama, that Hollywood had trained itself to confuse performance with character. And Crawford, he said, was the most extreme version of that confusion he had ever witnessed. Because behind the gates of her Brentwood mansion, far from the cameras and the reporters, Joan Crawford was living a completely different story. Her daughter, Christina, would one day write a book about her childhood called Mommy Dearest. What she described inside it was not the life of a glamorous Hollywood mother. It was a childhood built on fear. Crawford controlled everything: what the children ate, what they wore, how they stood, how they slept. The slightest mistake could mean punishment that went on for hours. Wire hangers became weapons. Children were made to kneel for long stretches of time. Punishments were given in the middle of the night when the children had been dragged from sleep and had no idea what they had done wrong. A domestic worker who was employed at the Crawford house during Christina's childhood later spoke about what she had seen. She described a woman who could be perfectly charming in one moment and terrifyingly cold the next, who would pose with her children for magazine photographs one afternoon and then send them to bed without food that same night. The contrast was what made it so disturbing. Hollywood put Crawford on covers, celebrating her as the ideal mother. Studios used her family as part of her public image. And all of it was built on a lie so enormous that the people inside the house spent years too frightened to tell anyone the truth. When Crawford died in 1977, she left her son and daughter completely out of her will. Her reasoning, as written in the document, was simply that they knew why. No further explanation. It was, as Newman later described it, a woman who found one final way to use power against the people she was supposed to protect. Now, if Crawford's story makes you feel cold, the next one is going to make it worse. Because the second name Newman mentioned carried the exact same brand of cruelty. Except this one came with Christmas music. Bing Crosby was beloved in a way that is almost impossible to overstate today. White Christmas is still one of the best-selling music recordings in human history. His radio shows made families gather together in their living rooms and feel safe. NBC called him America's model dad. Life magazine put him on its cover as the perfect father. Churches loved him, schools loved him, grandparents loved him. Paul Newman, in an interview with Esquire in the early 1980s, said something that stuck with everyone who read it. He said that Crosby was a jailer dressed as an angel, and once you hear what his sons described, that line starts to feel less like poetry and more like a factual report. Gary Crosby, the eldest son, eventually wrote about his father in a book that stunned readers when it came out. He described a household where the famous warmth Crosby projected on radio and television was completely absent at home, where the man who made the world feel cozy at Christmas was, behind closed doors, a cold and violent presence. Gary described hiding as a child, listening for sounds in the house, trying to tell by footsteps and silence whether it was safe to breathe easily. He said his father never expressed affection toward him, that there were no hugs, no encouragement, just fear and distance and sudden eruptions of physical punishment that came without warning. The damage spread through the Crosby family in ways that are painful to trace. 2 of Bing's sons died by suicide. Dennis left a note before he died in 1989. The note spoke about Christmas and nightmares. Lindsay died the following year. A musician who had toured with Crosby spoke to the Los Angeles Times years later and described hearing sounds from behind a closed door during a house visit. A crack, a child crying, and then silence. He said he never told anyone at the time because he knew it would have ended his career on the spot. Newman was asked once to consider whether Crosby's own difficult upbringing might explain his behavior. His answer was flat and immediate. He said excuses do not cancel out what was done to those children. And he was right. What connects Crawford and Crosby is not just the cruelty, it is the armor. The public image so perfectly constructed, so warmly maintained, that it made the private reality almost impossible for the outside world to believe. The studios knew how much those images were worth. So the images were protected, no matter what was happening behind them. That is the system Newman was describing. Not just the behavior of bad individuals, but the machine that made their behavior invisible. And when we get to the next name, the machine's role becomes even more obvious, because this man was actually charged with criminal behavior. And Hollywood still looked the other way. Section 3, when the cameras rolled and the truth got buried anyway. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood looking like something a screenwriter invented. Tall, effortlessly charming, with a grin that said he knew exactly how good-looking he was and had decided to enjoy every second of it. His breakout role in The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938 made him a superstar almost overnight. Women wanted to be near him. Men wanted to be him. Photoplay magazine called him the man every woman longed for. But the rumors about Flynn had been circulating through Hollywood well before the world knew his name. Whispers about parties at his house in the Hollywood Hills, about guests who were far too young, about an atmosphere where saying no to Flynn was understood to come with consequences. In 1942, everything broke open. Flynn was charged with the criminal assault of 2 teenage girls. The Los Angeles Examiner ran the story across its front page. The courthouse was packed with reporters, fans, photographers, and onlookers who could not quite believe that their swashbuckling hero was sitting at a defendant's table. The details that came out during the trial were deeply uncomfortable. Witnesses described parties at a Hollywood apartment. Young girls present in circumstances no responsible adult should have permitted. Flynn moving through those spaces with a confidence that came, as one writer later put it, from knowing that power and fame were better protection than a locked door. Flynn was acquitted. When he walked out of the courthouse, he lit a cigarette, turned to the crowd of reporters, and said that the ladies would still love this Robin Hood. Paul Newman, who heard the story secondhand from people who were present, said he had never heard arrogance described so nakedly. Not arrogance as a personality trait, arrogance as a weapon. Because here is the thing about that acquittal. It was not simply the result of the evidence being insufficient. The machinery of Hollywood protection was working full-time during that trial. Studio representatives were working relationships. Friendly journalists were managing stories. Powerful people were making phone calls. Flynn was too valuable a product to let go down, so the system protected the product. Reporter Sheila Graham, one of Hollywood's most connected gossip columnists, wrote in 1945 that if the walls of Flynn's home could speak, no one in the industry would want to hear what they had to say. She was not being dramatic. She was describing something she had been close enough to glimpse, even if she could not print everything she knew. What haunted Newman about Flynn was not just the specific accusations. It was the way the industry responded after the acquittal as if nothing had happened. Studios celebrated. The press moved on. The films kept coming. And Flynn's reputation shifted from something clouded by a criminal trial back to the romantic rogue image that had always sold tickets. Newman said that Flynn's death in 1959 in Vancouver was reported with eulogies that read like they were about a different person entirely. The Hollywood version of Flynn, all charm and adventure. Not the Flynn that witnesses had described. Not the Flynn that the 2 girls at the center of that 1942 trial had experienced. Their version never made it into the obituaries. Now let's move to a name that might surprise you even more than Flynn. Because this one was not just loved by audiences. He was adored by them. A child star who became the kind of adult that some of the people around him were genuinely afraid of. Mickey Rooney was MGM's most profitable star for years. The Andy Hardy films made him the face of wholesome American boyhood. Life magazine put him on the cover. Critics wrote about his natural talent as if it were a gift from somewhere sacred. He was the little guy with the enormous smile and the energy that never seemed to run out. Elizabeth Taylor knew a different version. Taylor started at MGM as a child herself. She was 14 years old when National Velvet came out and made her famous overnight. And around that same time, Rooney, who was already nearly 25 and one of the studio's biggest stars, began directing his attention toward her in ways that frightened her. Paul Newman described hearing about this from Taylor directly, years later, during a private conversation. He said she broke down talking about it, that she whispered she had been more afraid of Rooney than she had been of almost anyone, that she wore thick sweaters in summer to try to avoid his attention, that she wrote in her diary about feeling trapped inside the studio's golden machine, unable to leave, unable to speak up. MGM protected Rooney. When Hedda Hopper, one of Hollywood's most powerful gossip columnists, tried to write something that touched on his behavior, the studio forced a retraction within 24 hours. Editors were warned. The version of Rooney that the public was allowed to see was the one that MGM had approved. Anything else simply did not exist, as far as the studio was concerned. Taylor carried that experience quietly for the rest of her life. Friends said she would go silent whenever Rooney's name came up in conversation. There was no comfortable distance she ever seemed to reach from what had happened. Newman, at a press conference in 1982, was asked about Rooney directly. His answer was precise. He said that Hollywood had smiles that hid darkness, and that Rooney was one of the clearest examples. The public got the smile. The people around him got what was underneath it. The pattern here is not subtle. Flynn, Rooney, Crawford, Crosby, all beloved, all protected, all doing things that the people closest to them were either too frightened or too powerless to stop. But the next section is where the story gets even stranger. Because some of the names Newman spoke about were not just dark in their personal behavior. They were dark in ways that touched people who came near them, like a kind of gravity that pulled everyone into chaos. Section 4. The ones who left wreckage behind them. Bette Davis was a force. There is no other word for it. Her talent was real, enormous, and recognized by everyone who worked with her or watched her on screen. All About Eve made her one of the most celebrated actresses in Hollywood history. Critics wrote about her the way people write about lightning: unpredictable, blinding, impossible to ignore. But the people who actually shared sets with her often described something very different from the thrill audiences felt in the theater. Her temper was infamous inside the industry in a way that simply did not make it into the press. She could be warm and magnetic in front of journalists and then reduce a supporting actor to tears minutes later for standing in the wrong spot. Makeup artists at Warner Brothers described bracing themselves whenever she arrived on set. Crew members learned to read her footsteps in the hallway as a signal to get out of the way. The most extreme public example came during the production of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962, which she made alongside Joan Crawford. The two women despised each other with a thoroughness that the cast and crew found exhausting and sometimes genuinely frightening. In one scene, Davis physically shoved Crawford hard enough that Crawford ended up requiring hospital treatment for a head wound. Davis's response, when asked about it later, was to say that if Crawford got hurt, that was Crawford's problem. Crawford retaliated by hiding small metal weights under her costume during scenes where Davis had to physically move her. Davis strained her back, and the injury followed her for a long time afterward. The set became, as Variety described it, a battlefield. Two stars with enormous power, and no one senior enough to stop them from using it against each other. But Davis's behavior was not limited to her rivalry with Crawford. On the private lives of Elizabeth and Essex, she slapped Errol Flynn hard enough to leave a visible mark that lasted minutes. Another actor on a different production claimed he quit the industry entirely after Davis struck him with a rolled-up script for forgetting a line. Crew members across multiple productions described working around her as something you planned for carefully, the way you plan for unpredictable weather. Paul Newman witnessed her publicly humiliate a young actress on a set. He said afterward that no one denied Davis's talent, but that he had never seen a person spread so much fear through their presence alone. Now Marlene Dietrich is a different kind of story entirely. Where Davis spread fear through anger and physical outbursts, Dietrich was something colder, more calculated. She did not lose her temper. She used people with a precision that some who knew her described as almost clinical. Dietrich walked into rooms and owned them immediately. She dressed in ways that made everyone else in the room feel slightly underdressed. Her intelligence was real and sharp. But the people who got close to her rarely came out of the experience in good shape. Jean Gabin, the French actor who was considered one of the great loves of her life, fell into a deep depression after she left him. Eric Maria Remarque, the writer who created All Quiet on the Western Front, watched his royalties get spent on Dietrich's lifestyle while she was with him. Edith Piaf, the legendary French singer, reportedly spiraled after an affair with Dietrich, collapsing backstage during performances while still heartbroken. Dietrich's own daughter, Maria Riva, eventually wrote about growing up with her mother. She described watching people get treated like objects that served a purpose until they no longer did, and were then simply discarded. Relationships for Dietrich were not about connection. They were about control. And when she was done with someone, the ending was clean and final, and left the other person scrambling. A young actress who left her own promising career behind to follow Dietrich died by suicide and left a note behind. The note had 3 words: "I hate you." Newman described Dietrich as someone who treated emotion the way a card player treats a hand. She played better than anyone in the room, and the people who played against her consistently walked away with nothing. Kirk Douglas was celebrated as Hollywood masculinity itself. Spartacus, paths of glory, the strong jaw, the cleft chin, the force that came through the screen and made audiences feel safe behind him. He received the Medal of Freedom. He received an honorary Oscar. Studios loved him. Critics respected him. Behind that image were rumors that circulated quietly through Hollywood for decades. Rumors about his behavior toward very young women. Rumors that the studios heard and chose to protect because Douglas was too valuable to expose. The most specific allegation centered on Natalie Wood. In 1954, Wood was 15 years old. She was taken by her mother to the Chateau Marmont for what was described as a professional mentoring meeting with Douglas. According to her sister Lana's later memoir, Wood came home that afternoon shaken and in tears. In her private diary, she wrote that she needed to stay silent if she wanted to keep her career, but that she felt dirty in a way she could not shake. Hollywood kept that story completely buried for decades. When Wood died in a mysterious drowning off Catalina Island in 1981, the story surfaced briefly in whispers and was then pushed back down again. She was not the only one. Former studio workers described Douglas bringing very young women to his dressing room and creating career consequences for those who declined his attention. None of this was ever brought to formal accountability. Douglas collected honors and gave speeches. He stood on stages talking about inspiring young people. And some of the women in those audiences, Newman said, exchanged looks that told a story the speeches never touched. Newman's words about Douglas in a 60 Minutes conversation were short and direct. He said that Spartacus might have been a hero on screen, but that Douglas was never a hero to the young women he pursued. Wallace Beery is a name that fewer people know today, but inside Hollywood's golden age, he was enormous. His Oscar-winning performance in The Champ made audiences cry. Variety wrote about him as having a heart of gold inside a shell of steel. Kids loved him. Parents loved him. Behind that image was a man whose temper had produced a trail of accusations that the industry quietly ignored. His name became connected to the 1937 death of Ted Healy, the founder of the Three Stooges. Witnesses placed a large man matching Beery's description at a nightclub confrontation with Healy on the same evening that Healy was later found severely beaten in his hotel room. MGM arranged for Beery to leave for Europe within days of the incident. Police closed the case as alcohol-related. Journalists who tried to dig deeper found doors closed firmly in their faces. Former child actors who worked with Beery described rough, frightening behavior on set. Mickey Rooney claimed Beery struck him hard enough to knock him off his feet. Other crew members described extras physically moving away from Beery whenever he came near, an instinct born from experience. Gloria Swanson, who was briefly married to Beery in the early days of his career, wrote in her memoir that she filed for divorce as quickly as possible because of physical violence in the marriage. The divorce was handled quietly, and the public never knew the reason. Newman described Beery as a symbol of something larger than one man's behavior. He said Hollywood had known about the rumors for years and had always made the same choice: protect the profitable legend, bury the uncomfortable truth. Which brings us to the final story in this video, and it is, honestly, the strangest one, because it does not just involve allegations of bad behavior. It involves a death, a mystery, and questions that have never been fully answered. Section 5. The darkest name on the list and the question nobody answered. Sal Mineo was supposed to be the next James Dean. He was that good. His performance in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955 earned him an Oscar nomination and made him a star almost instantly. Young, magnetic, emotionally raw in a way that the camera caught and audiences felt deeply. But Mineo was openly gay at a time when being openly gay in Hollywood was not just career-limiting, it was dangerous. The studios were built on images of traditional romance and masculine heroism. There was no room in that machine for a leading man who was honest about who he was. Roles began to disappear. Press coverage shifted from admiring to mocking. The New York Times later described what happened to him as honesty being punished. He retreated somewhat from the spotlight and built a quieter life in West Hollywood. He maintained a relationship with stage actor Courtney Burr III. He continued trying to find work. And around his name, certain rumors circulated that connected him to Paul Newman in ways that neither man ever publicly addressed. People who frequented the same spaces described seeing Newman at Mineo's apartment on late evening visits. A bartender who worked nearby recalled seeing them together and noticing a tension between them that felt like something more complicated than casual friendship. Newman's hand on Mineo's shoulder. Mineo with a cigarette, nervous, quiet. A diary attributed to Mineo reportedly contained a line that has been repeated and debated ever since. The line described Courtney as someone Mineo loved and Newman as his greatest fear. That if the truth of their connection became public, Mineo would pay the price. Whether this diary was authentic has never been conclusively established, but the line has followed both names for decades. On February 12, 1976, Sal Mineo was stabbed outside his West Hollywood home. He died at the scene. He was 37 years old. Police arrested a drifter and described the killing as a random robbery gone wrong. The case was closed relatively quickly, but the inconsistencies never went away. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Physical evidence had gaps. The confession that prosecutors relied on struck several observers as coerced rather than genuine. Mineo's apartment was later discovered to have been ransacked. Certain personal papers were missing. A building manager claimed to have seen someone resembling Newman entering the building around the time the apartment was disturbed, though this was never confirmed by any other source. Financial records that were leaked in the years following the case described transfers associated with a fund connected to Newman. The specifics were murky, and the record's authenticity was never established. But the combination of all these details, the inconsistencies in the investigation, the missing papers, the unverified sightings, the sealed FBI documents, kept speculation alive long after the official case was closed. The FBI's decision to seal portions of the investigative file was described by the agency as standard procedure. To the people who had been asking questions about Mineo's death for years, it felt like anything but standard. When Newman was eventually asked directly about Mineo's death, he gave an answer that people have been interpreting ever since. He said that Hollywood killed Sal Mineo. Not with a knife, but with silence. Some took that as a critique of the industry's treatment of gay performers, which was real and documented and devastating. Others heard something more personal in it, something that sounded less like analysis and more like grief. No one will ever know for certain what Newman meant. No one will ever know with certainty what happened to Sal Mineo, beyond the official account that many people found unconvincing. The FBI files remain sealed. The papers that went missing from his apartment never resurfaced. The questions never got complete answers. And that, in a way, is the most honest summary of everything Newman was trying to say across all these years of carefully chosen words and quiet interviews and moments of candor that caught journalists off guard. Hollywood was built on incomplete answers, on stories told halfway, on truths that got close enough to the surface to make everyone nervous but rarely broke through completely. The machine was too good at its job. The images were too valuable. The silence was too profitable. Newman understood all of this from the inside. He understood it the way you only understand something when you have spent decades watching it happen around you. When you have seen the people who spoke up get buried. When you have seen the people who stayed silent get protected. When you have watched a whole industry train itself, year after year, to choose the legend over the truth every single time. He was not perfect. No one who survives inside a machine like that is perfect. But he chose, in his own careful and deliberate way, to put some of the truth on the record, to say names out loud, to refuse to pretend that the glamour was the whole story. The names he named were not random. They were the most beloved, the most iconic, the ones that people still feel protective of today, even knowing what they know. And that is exactly the point Newman was making. The darkness was not hiding in the obviously suspicious places. It was hiding inside the warmth, inside the charm, inside the images that felt the safest. That is what made it so hard to see. That is what made it so easy to ignore. And that is why Paul Newman thought it was worth saying out loud. If this video opened your eyes to a side of Hollywood history you had not seen before, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss what we have coming next. Every week we go deeper into the stories that history tried to bury. And leave us a comment with this question. Which name on this list surprised you the most? And do you think Hollywood has actually changed, or is the same machine still running today?